Hello, UCAR. Peter Christensen here, coming to you from the CEO's desk. So, the UAR just released a few new forms. Correctly speaking, two updates and one entirely new form. So, I want to talk about those for a minute. So, it's the subject to sale of buyer's property addendum. That's a revamp of that, an update to that. And then the option to keep the property on the market time clause addendum. Those two have been updated, pretty significant changes. So good stuff to talk about. And then the buyer's notice to seller of removal of conditions, which goes along with the time clause addendum, is an entirely new form to use. I'm not going to do an overview in this video of those because we did one on a Facebook Live event a day or two ago. And we'll try to put a link to that video if we can in the comments, in the description maybe, so that you can go through. It's a very almost line by line overview with Kreg Wagner and Shane Norris, a couple of attorneys, and myself. So great info. Don't need to repeat that. So if you're wanting the overview, go check that out. And then what I'm going to do is make a few videos here of specific scenarios that might apply to these forms with the understanding that you have a general knowledge of how to use them. So let's jump into our first scenario right now. Okay, so buyer has an offer and the seller accepts it. And the terms of the offer are this. In section 2.2, buyer marks, yes, it is conditioned on the sale of buyer's property. Now, in that section, you'll notice it says that you will then include an addendum of the subject to sale of property of buyer's property. So we have that addendum ready for you. That's been updated. So that will be included. So the buyer marks that they will put $10,000 of earnest money. So $10,000 in earnest money. Then in 8.3B1 in the REPC, that's where the buyer can indicate whether or not some of that earnest money will go hard after the due diligence deadline, in essence. And the buyer puts $5,000 in there, trying to make the offer a little more enticing, puts $5,000 in there. So half of the earnest money. Okay, so the question... That's our scenario. Got a couple questions. What if the buyer cancels before the due diligence deadline based off of the subject to sale contingency? So now there's a new contingency introduced. You still have your due diligence. You still have your financing appraisal conditions in there if those all apply. And now we've added the subject to sale of buyer's property condition. That's a new condition in essence. So what if the buyer cancels before due diligence? Well, it really doesn't matter in this case whether they're using the subject to sale or they're using the due diligence contingency. It's a moot point because buyer will get all $10,000 of the earnest money back at that point because both contingencies would allow for the return of the earnest money. So the next question is, what if the buyer cancels after the due diligence deadline, but before the finance and appraisal deadline? If the property has not closed, buyer gets all $10,000 back. Now, if you remember, I'd mentioned 8.3B1 that the buyer put $5,000 in there. So why is the seller not getting that $5,000? Well, because the buyer is using the subject to sale contingency and not the finance contingency. Therefore, the terms of the subject to sale contingency, if you look at that addendum, are buyer will get all of their earnest money back. It doesn't say anything about being subject to any earnest money being forfeit because of waiting till that later deadline. So in the way this is designed, buyer would get all $10,000 back. Now, let's say the buyer's property had sold. So, 5-10 days into the transaction, the buyer closes on their property. but doesn't get as much out of it, has a change of heart, doesn't like the finances, and decides to back out after due diligence but prior to finance and appraisal. So home has sold but still wants to cancel prior to finance. Well, in that case, buyer would only get $5,000 back. Why? Because the option to use the subject to sale of buyer's residence contingency or buyer's property contingency is no longer available. Once the property closes, that condition disappears, right? Because right in there it says buyer's right to cancel before the due diligence deadline or financing appraisal deadline, whichever is later. This is in section 1A of the subject to sale of buyer's property addendum. And it says if buyer has not closed on the sale of buyer's property. So there we have a condition to the condition, right? You have to have that property still looming, the sale of that property still looming. So just this is getting really into the weeds on this addendum, but wanted to point that out, that it is a separate contingency to be used. It's not the same as finance. It's not the same as due diligence. It is a separate contingency, so it has slightly different rules to it, but can only be used until buyer's property closes. Once it's closed, then that is no longer available. Could still use finance in this contingency in this scenario, but would forfeit the money in 8.3B1. Hopefully that's clear. I kind of jumped in with this first hypo being a fairly complex one as far as operation of these forms, but I'll try to do 2 or 3 more of these hypos based off of these new forms or newly revamped forms, and hopefully won't confuse you too much. So hopefully that helped. Remember, this is not legal advice, just legal information only. If you need specific legal advice, contact your attorney. If you have questions, if I totally confused you, throw them in the comments. We'll try to clear it up. If you have other questions or hypos about these forms that you'd like to see addressed, by all means, throw those in as a suggestion, and maybe we'll do a video on those as well. Thanks for tuning in. Have a great day.